My next guest is Andrea Terrero Gabbadon, and she is a urban educator and leadership scholar, speaker, consultant, and qualitative researcher. Her work and research explore the intersection of culturally affirming leadership, school working conditions, and racial climate and educator diversity. Previously, she served as a high school teacher, teacher leader, assistant principal, and director of curriculum and instruction in traditional public and charter schools. Andrea has also served as a visiting professor and instructor of undergraduate and graduate education at numerous institutions of higher education, including Temple University and Swarthmore College. Her scholarship has been published in leading academic journals such as Urban Education and the Urban Review. She is also the author of Support and Retain Educators of Color, 6 Principles for Culturally Affirming Leadership in publication with ASCD. More importantly, she is an activist, committed partner, and devoted parent. Well, welcome to the podcast, Andrea.
Thank you so much for having me.
We'll start off with the question I ask everybody. Tell me about a time when you were in the trenches and managed to crawl out.
Goodness. So in terms of that particular question, it takes me back to probably my new days as a school leader. So I, like so many other people, did not intend to be a school leader, but rather I fell into the position as there was a vacancy at the time. And so being fresh out of the classroom, being, interviewing for this job, knowing that there was a need for a school leader at my building, getting the job. And I remember just being just so overwhelmed, right? You go from being a manager of students, a manager of curriculum, coordinating the learning of, for me at the high school level, it's about 150 bodies, right? But moving from that to thinking about, all right, at an organizational level, what do I need to do so that students, staff, community members can thrive? And how do I just create all of the logistics and maintain those logistics in a way that's sustainable, not just for those who I am serving, but for me? And so the spirit of like, who is here to help me figure this out definitely shines through as I think about, just those very early days, feeling very much in the trenches, 12 to 14-hour days in a school building, which I don't recommend to anyone, but that is all too often the story of educators when we are great at what we do and therefore have new avenues of leadership and responsibilities given to us, but we often aren't given the support, right? To allow us to not just excel at the work, but to allow the work to be sustainable for others and for us.
And so moving into the organizational leadership role, had you been able to use a lot of what you learned in the school leadership? Was that a difficult transition or did you feel well prepared?
It's a both and, right?
Yeah.
Uh, did I feel well prepared to some extent? I was pursuing a degree in school leadership at the University of Pennsylvania at the time, and they just did a phenomenal job, I think, providing support as much as possible from that lens at my program. But as I think back to my early days in my building, right, beyond the certification program, because again, I was getting the certification, but you often get the job after you complete the degree, not during, right? But there just happened to be a vacancy and a need. But when I think about my building, there were so often just a lapse in support, right? And so I was filling in for someone who had gone out on an unanticipated leave. I think we had a new principal at the time. I had, you have visits from your supervisor many times when you're an administrator, but so often, even those well-intentioned supports that come from upper management, they don't really feel like supports, right? It often feels as an added stressor, right? And so it was quite challenging at the time to navigate. I learned a lot of things, many of which I transferred over into my book, Support and Retain Educators of Color. But it was many often just finding mentors, finding folks that would just entertain my questions that allowed me to persevere in the work.
So let's shift over to talking about your book, Support and Retain Educators of Color, Six Principles for Culturally Affirming Leadership. So a lot of this you took from a personal experience. As we're recording this, it is in the summer and people are still recruiting leaders and assistant principals or teacher leaders. There's maybe not as much exodus at the teacher level, or sorry, at the principal level as there tends to be for teachers in movement, but there's still a lot of people just taking other jobs, and that might not just happen in the summer, it could happen throughout the school year. So what are some points that you really hone in on during your book? And like, we're talking about teacher shortage, but how can we center around educators of color in leadership?
You bring up so many interesting points just to kind of frame this overall
Mm-hmm.
argument. I think one thing that I want to bring up is, the book is grounded certainly in some element of my own background as an instructional leader, as a director of curriculum and instruction, as an assistant
Mm-hmm.
principal, and someone who kind of managed, the hiring and the support of educators in my building, particularly my own efforts to have a diverse teacher workforce, right, that
Mm-hmm.
reflected the student demographics of my mostly Black and Latino student population. But in addition to those personal experiences that I draw upon, I also glean upon my doctoral research, right? And
Mm-hmm.
I actually never intended to write a book, but
Mm-hmm.
during my doctoral research, I set out and did a national study of educators of color,
Mm-hmm.
and using qualitative measures was able to really learn a lot about what are the things that cause educators of color to stay and what are the
Mm-hmm.
things that cause them to leave. And as you mentioned, right, we're living in a current landscape of significant shortage and turnover. But the reality is that even prior to the pandemic, right, and continuing certainly now, we
Mm-hmm.
actually see educators of color leaving the profession at higher rates than their white counterparts.
Mm-hmm.
And that's problematic for all kiddos, right? Because we know that educator diversity is associated with positive academic and social and educational outcomes for all children. And so what I found is, uh, unlike many of the research around teacher turnover, which is linked to, policy, salary change, student behavior, aspects of curriculum and teacher autonomy, things of that nature, which certainly matter to educators of color,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because I don't want to make that a monolith, is that educators of color were leaving largely because of compounding school experiences over time, meaning
Mm-hmm.
that they weren't in workplaces that were affirming to who they were, that valued who they were. Instead of turnover, it really was a sense of being pushed out, right?
Mm-hmm.
Of a place where they wanted to be, but ultimately they chose to leave, not because of kids, but because of leaders, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, the book came about in a way that really prompts a teacher leader, an assistant principal, a principal, any type of organizational leader to think about what are the types of experiences that educators of color are having in my
Mm-hmm.
building, and
Mm-hmm.
how can I acknowledge the fullness of their humanity in the ways in which they want to show up in my building and
Mm-hmm.
hold space for that. And so that starts really with everything from acknowledging the importance of educator diversity, not being colorblind, but rather
Mm-hmm.
what some might call color brave, right? To the differences that make all of us unique and allow us to kind of engage in our shared humanity, to more nuanced, right? And specific ways that you can support educators of color. And I'm not going to dive into all six principles right now.
Mm-hmm.
Folks got to go out and get the book at
Mm-hmm.
ASCD.com or Amazon. But really, it's causing us to think about, and not to say that salary
Mm-hmm.
doesn't matter, not to say that teachers don't deserve autonomy. I've written about that elsewhere, but it's around our experiences in
Mm-hmm.
schools and how our educators and leaders really thinking seriously about the types of spaces that they're cultivating for
Mm-hmm.
educators of color.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we talked a lot in the pre-chat about affinity work. So just kind of from my experience, like I've worked in a couple of districts in the Denver metro area. One had a lot of work around culturally responsive teaching and DEI, and they had different affinity groups at the district level and at the school. However, many districts lack a lot of this work, or just starting with a lot of the work. So for districts that are looking into starting affinity groups, or just making an effort to attract and retain more educators of color, what are some of the things that they need to start off with thinking about?
Yeah, that is the question that I would encourage folks to think about if you're starting this work is like, what's the problem you're trying to solve,
Yeah.
right? And we may not think about it in terms of a problem, as in the same way we think about, let's say, the opportunity gap, right? Or the education debt, as Gloria Ladson-Billings describes it. But what are you trying to accomplish? And why do you need to focus specifically on the racial diversity of your educated workforce? I say this to say, someone, and I often hear this, right? All educators deserve high quality support. Yes, I'm a proponent of that, right? But is there a specific gap or a specific nuance that you're trying to address within your building? So, for example, if it is, is there, you can say, I want to implement affinity groups. Great. Why? What's the purpose? Is there something around social belonging that is currently missing and that the data within your building would point to? Is it an issue around retention? Is it an issue around voice and representation? If you're going to have an affinity group, you have to be clear around what is the goal for this affinity group, and how is this affinity group going to serve as an effective intervention for whatever this problem is? And so, going back to the social belonging or even voice and representation, I see districts all the time. All right, let's have an affinity group, but no one's showing up.
Sure.
No one's invested. And it's because there's a space, but you're creating essentially this intervention that folks have to now go to on their own time. Or you're saying, you can, this outlet of an affinity group is available. And yes, you can talk about your workplace concerns, but we're not going to do anything about it. Right. Or maybe there is an affinity group, but people don't really know it's a thing because maybe you haven't, maybe as a building principal or district leader, it hasn't been clearly endorsed that we have this affinity group that we value. We've created space for folks to go to it. And guess what? It's actually linked to our network-wide priorities around retention, right? And so again, starting at what is the issue that you're trying to solve? And, like all good educators, kind of working backwards with your design to address that issue.
Yeah, and you said also there's a lot about the teaching pipeline in terms of when we talk about retaining teachers of color and maybe moving them on to leadership roles. So how do you envision schools just keeping the teachers there in the district, especially if they're not addressing many of diversity issues or affirming issues?
In terms of how do I envision folks keeping, folks of color within a building or a district and supporting them in ways that they can thrive and ultimately move into leadership, it's really around kind of respecting, the fullness of one's being as a professional, right? So creating a space where folks can show up in the fullness of who they are, having systems, whether it's an affinity group, whether it's a mentorship program, whether it is kind of choice-based PD, creating outlets where where educators of color can be seen, valued, affirmed, and really further their professional interests, ultimately in ways that are in service of their students, right? We're not talking about these self-serving kind of interventions, because all of these things ultimately are to better support educators for the purpose of better supporting students. And so again, wanting to create a space where folks, right, there's these interventions. So again, mentorships, where there's a coaching program, where there's choice-based PD, affinity groups, where educators can go exist in community with educators who are like-minded, who reflect aspects of their own background. And that also the things that are bubbling up in these contexts, right? I'd have a place not only to share my
Mm-hmm.
concerns, but I also exist within an ecosystem where my concerns are responded to, right?
Mm-hmm.
Again, when we think about educators of color being underrepresented, when we think about voice and feedback, it is easy to ignore some of the important feedback that you might get from your educators of color within a particular context. And so not just having those quote unquote interventions or initiatives that are DEI focused, but
Mm-hmm.
thinking about how am I responding to the issues and concerns of those that are minoritized, those that are numerically underrepresented within my context. Because at the end of the day, if I value someone, I'm going to
Mm-hmm.
value their voice and opinion. And it shouldn't just be the loudest voice, it shouldn't just be the most robustly represented voice, but thinking about the specific concerns. Because again, educators of color, if we're thinking about identities and the
Mm-hmm.
ways in which folks of color are showing up in the world, right? We are experiencing things and vulnerable, right, to different factors that our colleagues that aren't of color are exposed to, right? So even thinking about my own positionality, identify as Latina, I'm a woman, right? I'm a,
Mm-hmm.
I'm a parent. I come from a certain socioeconomic background. I have a
Mm-hmm.
certain linguistic background. When I'm showing up in a school, I'm not just showing up as a professional. I'm showing us up as a professional whose
Mm-hmm.
experiences are impacted, right, with all of the
Mm-hmm.
isms that are often associated with those various minoritized identities. And so I would encourage building leaders, whether it is in the summer or whether it's throughout the year, yes, have those interventions, but what are you doing in response to the concerns of educators of color that are coming out of this, right? And what action are you taking? Again, that values or that conveys value to these individuals within your building or your network or your district.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. A lot of schools might be wanting to think about starting some book studies around maybe your book or other types of books around cultural responsive teaching, or even, cultural responsive or grading for equity, those types of things. So for those who want to start book studies, what are some important things to have in place around these conversations that might take place about what topics the books bring up?
That's such a wonderful question. I mean, I would say, look for a book, if at all possible, that
Mm-hmm.
is practitioner oriented, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, what do I mean by that? My book is designed for actually a book study kind of context.
Mm-hmm.
There are resources and discussion questions at the end of every chapter for the purpose of just engaging around these topics with other people. I know Goldie Muhammad's book. Actually, I think all of her books take a similar kind of approach, right? So for someone
Mm-hmm.
who is interested in learning more about historically and culturally responsive pedagogies, check out her work, as it kind of allows for that kind of dynamic book club style. But the first thing would be, again, if you're doing this at a school or a district level, how are you creating space
Mm-hmm.
in the school day for educators to attend? What we don't
Mm-hmm.
want to do, and I struggle a little bit with the term DEI because, DEI comes and goes. It's a fad, as we've
Yeah.
seen in 2020, and it goes away the next day, right? But this is justice work, right? And it's also nothing new because folks of color, if you go back over 100 years, right? Like we have been
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
champions for improving the quality of education for all babies, right? Going back since the beginning of public school.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, as a leader, again, how are you creating space in your school day? Two, creating holding space for educators to
Mm-hmm.
actually engage. So if it's during the school day, let's say during, PLC time,
Mm-hmm.
make sure that your teachers can go.
Mm-hmm.
So often I work with leaders and they have these great initiatives, but they also erect barriers that prevent people from going, right? So
Mm-hmm.
maybe it's you have to, rethink the lunch duty schedule, right? So that everyone in the 10th grade team is available to go to this book club and they're not pulled, right, to cover lunch for kids, right? Or maybe you need to use building subs or rethink what you're doing, the leadership team or community, right? Again, we got to think flexibly here. Another thing is, in addition to creating space in the school day, holding space for educators to do it, making sure that we're also really honoring kind of educators as professionals during this time. And so whether that is, um, providing, food, having kind of a well thought out session for them to engage with, whether that is making sure that the session is in a comfortable space, if it
Mhm.
has to be after school, if it's PD facilitation rate. And while these logistics may seem mundane and like, duh, Dr. Gabbadon, I get it. We have to think
Mhm.
through this. But if this is well put together and integrated into the ethos of the school, you're going to get better buy-in,
Mhm.
right? We also want to get the right people doing this, right? So making sure, yes, I mean, there's certainly value in having things mandated, but if this is the first time that your school community is engaging, maybe consider something that's choice-based to get, again, just a different type of conversation and momentum around these issues. And then I would also say, right, we can't have these conversations around race and equity and culturally affirming schools or culturally affirming pedagogy without creating space for educators to reflect on themselves and their identity. And
Mhm.
so if you're a building leader, creating space where you're doing that reflection as well, maybe bringing in an external facilitator to help other educators think through their identities and their kind of relationship to privilege and
Mhm.
access and marginalization, that is incredibly important. And many times I would recommend doing that in affinity, right?
Mhm.
So when you're
Mhm.
having a book study, whether it's around my book or Goldie Muhammad's work, or Tyrone Howard is coming out with a great new book as well, there's times where we need to have these conversations together and talk about these concepts and our school-based experiences
Mhm.
and our relationship to the constructs that we're reading about. But there's also importance around, like, let's interrogate what this means for ourselves as people, and we need to sometimes do that separately, because
Mhm.
what we don't want to do is having folks of color carrying the emotional labor that they often do within school systems, of having to explain their own experiences with racism. And then also, again, the conversations are very different. So we want to make sure that both spaces for folks of color as well as for their co-conspirators are productive and meet their needs.
Mhm. 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 Yeah, there was a lot of information there. And I think, like you said, what is important when you're starting out is really making that space that teachers are not giving up like their plan period, not requiring them to maybe be at a PLC at the same time every week if they wanted to spend maybe one Tuesday a week doing this book study or affinity group, right? Or if they have something district wide, that it's not necessarily like 3 times a year, right? That it's going to be continuous. But like you said, a lot of looking for books that are practitioner oriented, right? That has discussion questions, and then giving the chance for people to engage in that safe space. Very important topics to keep in mind. For districts that are already doing the work, um, if there are educators coming into the districts, um, what are some things, especially if the educators have a desire to make their classroom more culturally affirmative, and they might be coming from a district that, where they did a lot of this work, and they're really trying to bring that out in their new classroom. What are some things that they can do to keep that going if they're, coming to a district that might not be doing as much work as the prior district? Because there is a lot of difference depending on where you are.
Certainly. So are you asking on the leader end or the teacher end in terms of implementing culturally affirming
I
practices?
would I would say on this piece it would be the teacher end. And
Mhm.
looking at like activities in the classroom, curricular changes and holding
Mhm.
that space for their students.
Certainly, certainly. And so in terms of, I'm a big proponent of, you have to invest in yourself as a
Hmm.
professional, right? Similar to, my trenches story, right? Like, who is there to help me? Not many, but I
Hmm.
did have to go pursue my own professional development at times. And so
Hmm.
for those that are coming from a district that were well supported and well versed in terms of culturally affirming practices, and then you move to a space where that isn't, I would ask you, okay, what are you doing to further your learning?
Hmm.
What are the networks that you are connected to? In what ways are you continuing to interrogate your own identity, your own positionality in relation to your students and how that shows up? There's a phenomenal new book out, Shamari Reed, Humans Who Teach,
Mhm.
and he does a phenomenal job in really just encouraging teachers to think about, how am I creating spaces of love and safety for my students?
Mhm.
Goldie Muhammad's work around joy, right? How am I creating opportunities for students to experience joy in my classroom?
Mhm.
And these are questions that are transferable, right? That, you can think about how you're going to challenge yourself and how your students experience these constructs throughout the year. So again, professional development, who are you listening to? Who are you in community with? And really thinking about and creating space for, again, all of these things that you want your students to experience, and challenging yourself and making sure you're getting that feedback from them. Now, of course, right, you may encounter resistance
Mhm.
to these practices from principals, from other district leaders and officials, from community members and parents. And that's real. And that's when I
Mhm.
encourage folks to think about, or rather to procure the data, right, that says that students thrive academically and socially in these contexts,
Mhm.
right? And so making sure that you're prepared with a word, with a defense for when resistance uh, occurs, because it will occur, unfortunately. That's just the nature of the work that we do when
Mhm.
we are justice oriented.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, you talked in the pre-chat a little bit about how when you're trying to do this work in a new environment, the educator might feel isolated. Um, People might not understand just their I would say go getter attitude around implementing these practices if they've been in a district a long time that hasn't. Like you said, it is that isolating piece. But I think if an educator is really really willing to help find other educators maybe within their space and maybe start a book study, that is possible. It's just making sure that they, I would say, have the right programs in place. What would you say to that in terms of just for those resistance pieces?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, certainly, right? Finding your people within your
Yeah,
context helps, but I think what folks often don't realize is just how, I mean, we live in a big and beautiful country, right?
yeah,
There are so many different types of people, so many different types of advocacy organizations.
yeah.
So perhaps you don't have that space within your school. I think about, so many communities that I've worked in. Great leaders want to start an affinity space, but they tell me, Dr. Gabbadon, I have one educator of color. I have
Yeah.
two, right? Or even again, an educator who is interested in culturally affirming practices. They may not have a robust number that they can count on as their community. So my encouragement there would be, well, where can you find that community, right?
Hmm.
Where, use the internet, Google. I mean, just
Yeah.
off the top of
Yeah.
my head, in Pennsylvania, we have the Pennsylvania Educator Diversity Consortium. Two
Hmm.
goals around increasing the diversity of the educator workforce in Pennsylvania. The second is to provide culturally affirming and sustaining um, uh, kind of education for educators to do that work in their classroom. There's phenomenal work coming out of California, Institute for Teachers of Color, North Carolina, CREED, the exact
Hmm.
name escapes me, but I know they go by CREED, CREED. Um, Getting connected with universities, there are so many beautiful pockets of this resistance work
Hmm.
happening. Even thinking about publishers, ASCD. I mean, I've done book studies with my publisher, webinars. Hahnemann does similar work with their authors. Use Instagram, use Google, right?
Hmm.
There's so many different things. And so, we live in a connected world, and we want to leverage those connections
Yeah.
to sustain us, because
Hmm.
that's what it's about, right? If
Yeah.
no one else is, how are you going to sustain yourself in this work until you're able to be in a space that allows you to thrive in the ways that you need to?
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, that's so important. Finding those um groups of people, whether it's through social media posts or, like you said, organizations within your state or universities. If you don't have those people at your school or in your district, there are people that you can find. It's just doing a little bit of research, right? So, um, you also have some upcoming speaking engagements. I wanted to mention this will be coming out in October. So if you just list where you might be at conferences in the fall, in case people would like to come and hear you.
Yes, yes. So by the time the fall rolls around, I should be at the fifth annual Quantum Educational International Conference. If you are not going to that conference, you want to check something else out. By that time, I will have also recorded an episode with Baruti Kafele with the AP and New Principles Academy.
Mhm.
And so that should be available on YouTube. It's kind of situated a little bit like a webinar and should be available for broadcast for those that might be interested.
Great, great. Well, I definitely follow that AP and New Principles Academy, and I've had Rudy on, so I will put a link into that on the show notes, and yeah, so they'll be able to access that there. And out of everything we've talked about in terms of your book and your work and just your experience as a leader, what would you like listeners to remember?
What I want folks to remember is this question of what is the experience that educators of color are having in
Mhm.
my building?
Mhm.
What is the experience?
Yeah.
How do you know?
Mhm.
What data do you have, right? We always want to kind of lead with that data piece, but if nothing else, start with a question because that can help lead you to some potential answers, which will then allow you to think about ways in which you can create a culturally affirming environment, again, where educators of color can bring the fullness of themselves, feel safe, feel valued, feel seen, and listened to, which most importantly will support with retention.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, that's really important to think about. And as a leader, just really getting to know your educators and reaching out to them and having those conversations just around how they are as educators in the building within the space, right? So, where can people connect with you and find you online?
Yes, so you can connect with me on LinkedIn, Andrea Terrero Gabbadon. You can find me there. I'm also on Twitter, and Twitter is AT Gabbadon. And I'm also on Instagram. I do have a new website that should be launching within the next week. URL is TBD, but I'll make sure to get that over to you, Dana, at your earliest convenience. I also want to
Okay.
make sure folks remember just to check out the book, Support and Retain Educators of Color. Again, available ASCD.com or Amazon.
Great. Well, thank you so much for being on the Out of the Trenches podcast today. It was a pleasure talking with you around your work and your book.
Thank you for having me.